The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse crackled with anticipation, a silent storm of judgment swirling around the courtroom. Rows of spectators, their faces a mixture of curiosity and morbid fascination, filled the gallery, their hushed whispers creating a palpable tension. At the defendant's table, J.D. Vance, a young man barely out of his teens, seemed dwarfed by the imposing legal machinery surrounding him. His hands, though tucked casually into his pockets, betrayed a hidden steel. His chin was lifted, not in defiance, but in a quiet, unwavering resolve. Accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest, the charges against him were serious, but the way Judge Walter Caldwell, a man whose liberal leanings were as well known as his sharp tongue, looked at him suggested a deeper, more personal battle. Caldwell leaned back in his high-backed chair, his fingers drumming a lazy rhythm against the polished wood of his desk. He peered down at J.D. over the rim of his glasses, his lips twisting into a sneer that barely masked his contempt. "You think you're some kind of legal prodigy, Vance?" His voice dripped with condescending amusement. "This isn't a Sunday school debate, son." A wave of chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, and even the slick, ambitious prosecutor, Aaron Davies, seemed to revel in J.D.'s perceived naivete. But J.D. didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. Years of relentless preparation had forged within him a quiet confidence. He hadn't envisioned standing here as a defendant, but he knew the intricacies of the courtroom better than most. While other kids chased fleeting trends, J.D. devoured legal texts, dissecting cases with a laser-like focus. His upbringing in Middletown, Ohio, a crucible of struggle and resilience, had instilled in him a deep understanding of the law's power, both to uplift and to crush. He'd witnessed firsthand how easily the system could fail those who lacked the knowledge or resources to defend themselves. His grandmother, Mama, a force of nature forged in the fires of Appalachian hardship, had hammered into him the importance of fighting for what was right, no matter the odds. Those lessons, etched into his very soul, were what brought him here today. But none of that mattered to Caldwell. To the judge, J.D. was just another statistic, another misguided youth caught in the gears of the justice system. "Let's make this quick." The judge sighed, flipping open the case file with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "I have a charity gala at 2. The audience chuckled again, but this time, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. J.D.'s lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. Caldwell had just made his first, critical mistake. The prosecutor, Aaron Davies, rose from his seat, radiating an aura of smug certainty. His tailored suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice brimming with the practiced confidence of a man who had delivered the same performance 100 times before. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonating through the courtroom. "The state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, J.D. Vance, was apprehended red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he brazenly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The crowd in the gallery shifted, their whispers growing louder. On the surface, it sounded damning: a stolen car, a high-speed chase, a clear-cut arrest. Judge Caldwell glanced at J.D. over the rim of his glasses, then turned back to Davies with a nod. "Proceed." Davies, emboldened, walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this is all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Vance is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He paused, locking eyes with J.D. for the first time, a flicker of disdain crossing his face. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim leads the police on a wild goose chase?" The tension in the room was now a palpable force, pressing down on everyone present. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, his expression unreadable. J.D. remained motionless, his gaze steady, betraying no sign of fear or intimidation. Davies continued, flipping through a stack of papers with a flourish. "Your Honor, I have here the sworn testimony of Officer Olson Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to evade arrest. The car was confirmed stolen, and the arrest was made by the book. He concluded his statement, his voice ringing with finality. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. Sounds straightforward to me. And for most in the room, it probably did. The case seemed airtight, the evidence irrefutable. But J.D., having spent years meticulously studying the nuances of the legal system, saw the subtle cracks beneath the surface. He remained silent, however, his eyes narrowed, watching, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Judge Caldwell tapped his gavel lightly, breaking the tense silence. All right, let's hear the defense's response. He turned to J.D.'s court-appointed lawyer, Alicia Jenkins, a young public defender who had barely uttered a word since entering the courtroom. She stood up hesitantly, shifting nervously in her ill-fitting suit. J.D. placed a reassuring hand on her arm, a silent request for her to yield. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his, then slowly sat back down. And for the first time, J.D. Vance spoke, his voice clear and unwavering. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Caldwell stared at him, his amusement quickly turning to incredulity. You'll what? J.D.'s voice remained calm and steady. I'll be defending myself. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up, and Davies's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. This should be interesting, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But no one was laughing when J.D. took his first step forward. The weight of the courtroom settled around him, and the eyes of everyone present focused on his every move. He adjusted his stance, his hands still tucked casually into his pockets, and let the silence stretch for a few heartbeats, long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice resonating with an unexpected authority. Your Honor, he began. Before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution. Davies raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his chest, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. Be my guest. J.D. took a slow, deliberate step forward. You stated that Officer Olson Rees personally witnessed me behind the wheel before my arrest. Is that correct? Davies exhaled sharply, already bored with what he assumed would be a feeble attempt at denial. That's right, Vance. And that testimony is documented in his official report. Of course it is. J.D. nodded, then turned to Judge Caldwell. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Caldwell squinted at him, his initial amusement fading into a flicker of intrigue. On what grounds? J.D. finally pulled his hands from his pockets, gesturing towards the prosecution's table. Because Officer Rees never saw me in that car. He wasn't even on duty when the alleged chase began. A wave of confusion washed over Davies's face. What are you talking about? J.D. took another step forward, closing the distance between them. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to request verification of Officer Rees's GPS logs from that night. If his report accurately reflects his observations, then his location data should corroborate his presence at the scene. But, he paused, letting the word hang in the air. I have a strong feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery swelled to a low roar. Caldwell frowned, glancing sharply towards Davies, whose face was now a mask of barely suppressed anger. Davies cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. That report was filed by a sworn officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we seriously considering taking the word of a defendant over the testimony of a trained professional? J.D. gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claims to have been, then the GPS data will readily confirm it. But if he wasn't... He let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Caldwell studied him for a long moment, then turned his gaze towards Davies. Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS logs? Davies hesitated, a flicker of panic in his eyes. The pause, though brief, was telling. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, the judge noticed. J.D. took a quiet breath, the years of studying trials, analyzing prosecutors, and understanding their tactics paying off. He knew that if Davies were confident in his case, he wouldn't hesitate to verify the GPS data. The stalling was a clear sign of weakness, a crack in the prosecution's carefully constructed facade. Caldwell sighed, rubbing his temple, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Davies finally shook his head, his voice tight. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already occurred. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The silence was deafening, the tension palpable. Davies shuffled his papers, his polished confidence cracking around the edges, revealing the desperation beneath. "Your Honor," he continued, his voice strained, "while we await the GPS records, the undeniable fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." JD gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "That's true," he acknowledged, taking another step forward. "But let's examine that evidence a little more closely." Caldwell raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. JD turned to the jury, making direct eye contact with each member, drawing them into his narrative. "The prosecution wants you to believe that the presence of my fingerprints in a car automatically implicates me in its theft. That's the story they're selling. But let's consider this logically." He took a deep breath, his tone calm and controlled, resonating with sincerity. "Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then hang it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it automatically make you the thief?" A few jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. JD didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. "I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes," he admitted, "as we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, out of idle curiosity. I didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't take the car, I didn't drive it, I didn't steal anything from inside. It was just a dumb, impulsive moment." He paused, letting his words sink in, then asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Does simply touching something make you a criminal?" Davies cleared his throat, flipping frantically through his notes, searching for anything to regain control of the narrative. But JD wasn't finished. "And while we're on the topic of evidence," he continued, his voice gaining momentum, "let's talk about the fingerprint analysis itself." He turned to Caldwell. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who analyzed this case subpoenaed to testify?" Caldwell blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Davies, who hesitated, then reluctantly shook his head. "No, Your Honor." JD's lips pressed together, his eyes flashing with righteous indignation. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The state is attempting to convict me based on forensic evidence, but they didn't deem it necessary to bring in the actual specialists who processed that evidence. No opportunity for me to cross-examine them, to inquire about the chain of custody, or to challenge the accuracy of their analysis." Davies's jaw tightened, his face flushed with anger. JD nodded as if that was all the confirmation he needed. "Interesting." Judge Caldwell sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He was a man acutely aware of the shifting tides in the courtroom, realizing that this case was rapidly transforming from an easy victory into a potential disaster. But JD wasn't done yet. The next revelation would change everything. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Caldwell frowned, his confusion evident. "The owner?" JD nodded. "Yes, Mr. Samuel Peterson, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police that, for reasons unknown, was never included in the prosecution's filings. And I believe I know why." He turned to Davies, his eyes narrowed. "Do you recall what Mr. Peterson told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Davies's jaw clenched, his face paling. He knew exactly what was coming. JD didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled a printed transcript from his file and read aloud, his voice clear and unwavering. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. JD held the paper aloft, displaying it to the jury. That's directly from the original police report, the same report that the prosecution conveniently chose to ignore. He turned back to Judge Caldwell. The arresting officer corroborated this in his sworn testimony, yet the prosecution deliberately suppressed this exculpatory evidence. And now, he said, his voice dripping with scorn, they expect this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even remotely match the description of the actual thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Davies stepped forward, scrambling to regain control. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was apprehended in possession of the vehicle. JD shook his head, his voice sharp and decisive. No, I wasn't. The denial hung in the air, heavy with truth. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car, I wasn't near the car, I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is shoddy police work and baseless assumptions. Judge Caldwell let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples, his face etched with weariness. The case was unraveling before his eyes, the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative crumbling into dust. JD turned back to the jury, his voice resonating with passion. The real suspect got away that night. The officers, perhaps driven by bias or simply eager to close the case, found a young black man in the vicinity and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is truly about. A profound silence settled over the courtroom, broken only by the faint rustling of papers. Caldwell cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, his gaze fixed on JD. Does the prosecution have anything further to add? Davies stood stiffly, his face flushed with humiliation. No, Your Honor. Judge Caldwell exhaled slowly. He looked at JD for a long moment, then glanced at the jury, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would forever be etched in the memories of everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence hung in the air, followed by an eruption of chaos. The courtroom exploded with a cacophony of voices, some expressing disbelief, others whispering in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, their cameras poised to capture the aftermath. JD remained motionless, allowing the moment to sink in, allowing the reality of the verdict to resonate with everyone present. Judge Caldwell, still gripping his gavel, looked at JD with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even a hint of regret. JD met his gaze, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again, his voice tinged with a newfound respect. Mr. Vance? JD stopped but didn't turn around. Caldwell hesitated, then finally said, You should consider law school. JD smirked, a flash of triumph illuminating his face. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with the frenzied energy of the media. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Mr. Vance, did you anticipate the judge would dismiss the case? What are your plans for the future? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? JD pulled his hoodie over his head, shielding his face from the barrage of questions. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about ego or personal validation. It was about something far bigger. His grandmother, Mama, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and concern. Then, finally, she shook her head and let out a breath. JD Vance, you scared me half to death. JD chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Mama? She stared at him for another second, then pulled him into a tight hug, her grip surprisingly strong. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras continued to flash, but JD wasn't paying attention to them anymore. He was focused on his Mama, the woman who had instilled in him the values of hard work, resilience, and fighting for what's right. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Caldwell watched the scene unfold. His posture was different now, the arrogance gone, replaced by a contemplative demeanor. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else entirely, something closer to introspection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine, just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now he knew he would remember this one. J.D. Vance had done something that most people never could. He had forced the system to confront its flaws, to examine its inherent biases. And for once, the system had blinked first. Here's the lesson we should all learn from this story. How many other cases have unfolded similarly? How many individuals have been unjustly convicted, not because of irrefutable evidence, but because of prejudice, shortcuts, and a system that prioritizes closing cases over seeking the truth? J.D. Vance possessed the knowledge and the courage to fight back. But what about those who lack the resources, the support, or the understanding of the legal system to defend themselves? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. J.D. Vance knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney, a champion for the voiceless, a defender of justice. And when that day comes, he won't be the only one.